So our last panel for the day is a really great one. Perspectives and progress for the inclusion of underrepresented populations in clinical trials. And our speakers are really diverse and wonderful. I'm going to introduce each speaker briefly, and then I'm going to ask them to talk about what they are doing to work on inclusivity in their different areas. So first up is Prof. Moji Adeyeye, who's the Director General of Nigeria's National Agency for Food and Drug Administration and Control. So she's a regulator, and so we're in good hands. The next speaker is Dr. Jean-Marie Habarugira, who's the Senior Scientific Officer at EDCTP3, which is a European African partnership to alleviate the burden of infectious diseases in Africa. Then we have Dr. Rika Chandra, who's the clinical development head at Novartis Global Health, and she'll be speaking on behalf of Novartis of the IFPMA. And then we have Ransi Chidebe, who's the founder of a cancer advocacy organization called Project Pink and Blue in Nigeria. So, Prof. Moji, can you just introduce yourself briefly and also tell us how you in your work and as a regulator are trying to improve inclusivity in trials? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary Kerry. I'm sorry. I want to thank IFPMA for inviting me and others. It's a very, very important issue. From the regulator's perspective, it is a given that the diversity in terms of the demographics must be such that women, pregnant women, children, special populations are included in clinical research. I want to share an acronym, DAC: Design, Analyze, and Communicate for effective clinical research. Those three activities must be included in the protocol, or before you even think of writing the protocol. Because for us as a regulator, what we are looking for are indicators or indicative results that reflect what is going on in the community. So we have, of course, our ethics committee, and then we have our own committee in NAFDAC, Nigeria. And the design, analyze, and communicate, we have built that into what we want to see in a protocol that is submitted. And the design aspect of it is easier to understand. Even the analyze part of it is easier to understand from the scientific perspective, but the communicate aspect of it sometimes eludes researchers. And that is where women, underrepresented minorities, the community as a whole comes in. We had, or I had before joining NAFDAC, a clinical trial on sickle cell for children in Nigeria, and I partnered with a pediatrician, the chief pediatrician of the hospital. But we just didn't partner. We've been working with parents. We've been working with of course, the pediatrician has been working with the children. They are in the database. Therefore, a lot of exchanges or information sharing took place long before the trial began. Because people are not, especially in the low middle income countries, people are afraid of clinical trials. What is it? What is in it? What are they going to give me? What am I going to be, inject into me or whatever? But once you get involved with the community and you look at the demographics of the community, women, children, geriatrics, of course, men, motor unions, all, we went to church. We are churches. We went to mosques to talk with the imams, just to let them know that what we are trying to do is going to benefit the community on the long run. Therefore, that design, analyze, and communicate, the communicate part is huge in ensuring successful clinical research. I will just stop there, and I believe that I will be given other chance. Thank you so much.
You'll be given plenty of chances. You might even get tired of me asking you. So thanks for stopping there. Jean-Marie, what about you? Can you maybe tell us a little bit about your organization? Because I think maybe people don't know about it, and then also how you are working on inclusivity. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. I'm Jean-Marie Viana-Barugida, as you heard. I'm a senior scientific officer at the Global Health Initiative 3. This is, as Kerry was mentioning, it's a partnership between Europe and Africa to tackle infectious diseases. And it's an equal partnership where you have the European Commission representing the European Union and a number of countries in a group called EDTP Association that includes 31 African countries from sub-Saharan Africa. And those countries, together with the Commission, they define our strategy. There is funding from the European Union, but there's also funding from all those members I was mentioning of the association. So it's a truly equal in terms of financing, but also defining the strategy of what we do. Now, my work, I'm part of a science and operations team that work to design our main tool. We launch calls for proposals, and researchers do apply to the calls for proposals. So it is our responsibility to make sure from the base that call mentions what we need to achieve in terms of including everyone, those that need to be included in studies, those that have been neglected in the past historically. But it's also our responsibility to make sure, because these studies happen in sub-Saharan Africa on infectious disease that are affecting many sub-Saharan Africa, to make sure they do have a meaning for the communities where these studies take place. But on top of that, we have to design this call in a way that future projects are delivering something for the policymakers, not just something to be published and pack and go, but something for long term. At the same time, we do insist in these calls that they have to be capacity building where you do have these study centers in terms of skills for personnel, but also for future capabilities to respond to diseases, to manage disease, that it should be there. So, and this, it does not have to be just in cities where you have the great hospitals. You have also to look at those communities that in some countries you may call hard to reach. In some other countries, you may call them isolated communities. But again, back to your question, I was happy to see the colleague from MMV who was presenting these studies on malaria in pregnant women. These studies, they materialize because of that intentional design of a call text. If you do not include in your call text that studies focusing on pregnant women are encouraged or are preferred, if for that matter, depending on the product being developed, you do not get that project such as Sapphire. It's because we do make sure the call is calling for the right project. So every word counts when we are designing these topics. And we do have a number of stakeholders who come together with us and make sure that is done. And maybe a few examples will be coming up later when we discuss. These things can differ from disease to disease. So one aspect that we have noticed is this whole link, for example, between countries that have managed diseases for many years versus new pathogens. I'm trying to make an example of HIV versus Mpox, where you do have a certain group which is much more at risk compared to the rest. That is, for example, the HIV patient communities. If those patients are in areas affected by mpox, then by definition, they become the ones you cannot ignore at all. And within those kind of groups, you do have, for example, the gay communities that are maybe in some countries left behind for several reasons. So if you are not careful enough to mention all these elements, you end up thinking that you are responding to an mpox outbreak, but you are not including this group, which may be the one suffering from the highest death toll. So it's all these things which we try to capture from experience. We've been funding clinical research in Sub-Saharan Africa for more than 20 years or so. All that experience gets taken into how we design these calls that bring us to the projects that we are talking about. I'll stop there and take questions later, maybe.
Thank you, John Maria, and I hope that everybody online knows that there are opportunities there. There'll be calls that you can respond to because people are always looking for opportunities. So that's excellent. Rika, are you with us, or are you? I know that Rika's in Ghana and she's been having some connectivity issues. Are you with us, or I think she might have just stepped off. So Ransi, I'm going to go to you then. You are a patient advocate, and you're also an oncology researcher. So maybe just explain a little bit about your organization, but also how you are looking at inclusivity from the patient's point of view. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very, very much. My name is, Ron C.W. Chidepe. I'm the founder and also the executive director of Project Pinglu, a nonprofit that is based in Nigeria. And the work we really do is around, we started our work around awareness, educating patients. And actually Project Pinglu started as a national youth service program, as over 10 years ago. But right now, we have grown to become one of the leading cancer organizations, having staff and raising, thousands of dollars in different projects and activities in the country. However, along the line in the work that we're doing, we realize that most of our patients usually complain that they actually take chemotherapy, take medications, and they feel like it doesn't work for them. Or they feel like, after taking these medications, that they don't get any return on investment. They don't get probably longevity, or they don't even get good quality of life, which is what begin to raise our consciousness, begin to raise our concern in 2018 to begin to ask the question, what exactly can we do to help our patient understand their treatment and care better? And our project went from just creating awareness about cancer in the public space to what we call Upgrade Oncology, where we are now working with the US Department of State, with the Fulbright Specialist Program, with Roche Pharmaceuticals, and so many other organizations to actually bring experts. So every 2 years, we bring experts from the US to come to Nigeria to provide training to our own oncology. And we begin to really see how that could help improve care and how that could really help support the workforce in the country and strengthen them with all the capacity. However, the problem still persists because most of the oncology medications are not field tested, with our people, and that becomes a huge issue. And because if you don't solve the foundational problem, then we might just be all raising awareness, doing all this advocacy without not truly helping this patient that needs this help. Africa today hosts only 4% of global clinical trials, whereas the country have over 25% of global disease burden. Specifically in the oncology where I work, about only less than 109 open oncology clinical trials exist across Africa. And metastatic cancer, for instance, the WHO has stated that the greatest burden of cervical cancer would exist in low and middle income countries, where Nigeria is actually the largest Black country in the world, meaning that Nigeria will have that greatest burden by 2040. But the problem is a TC2MAP, which is a medication used for treating metastatic cervical cancer. It is painful that when clinical trial on those medication was done, 95% of people that were recruited in that metastatic cervical cancer metastatic medication was 95% of white people. Only 1% were Black and 2% Asian. So, when we talk about underrepresentation, it's really important to understand that all these statistics that we're talking about are women who these diseases were taken at their prime. These diseases don't take them, it takes them when they are more useful to the society, when they are contributing to the society, when women are like the grandparents, when they are grooming the generation that could really support the next generation. So it's really important to understand that patients are so important to be included in this conversation. And I'm very, very excited that I can have this opportunity to uplift and put in those voices of the patient. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much, Ransi, and thanks for reminding us that we're not talking about statistics, but real people. And Rika, I'm glad you managed to pop back up again. Thank you. We're going to grab you now before you disappear. You have a wealth of experience as a clinical development head at Novartis. So maybe you can just give a little introduction about how you've been involved in working with underrepresented populations and what you're doing to try and improve inclusivity. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Kerry, and thank you to IFPMA for inviting me for this very important discussion and dialogue. My background is I'm a physician scientist from India, as you can make out from my accent, but I'm based in US now for last 25 years, and right now I'm heading clinical development for global health programs at Novartis. Before that, for about 19 years, I was at Pfizer. Most of my work was on developing new medicines for infectious diseases. But I started my career in industry way back in India, where I feel very proud that I was responsible for leading first 3 clinical trials as per ICH GCP in India. And this was in close collaboration with Indian Council of Medical Research and Drugs Controller General's India office. And these trials were Ransi, to your point, one was in advanced breast cancer, one was in resistant schizophrenia, and one was in malaria. So we wanted to make sure that India is able to come up to the expectations that are required for stringent regulators. And it was a lot of work. I used to say we are in the business of constructing roads of clinical research in India. And that was about 25 years ago. And fast forward, I got involved very closely, and I was leading malaria development program at Pfizer in close collaboration with MMB, Gates Foundation, and London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And we were working on not just adults and pediatric in children, but also in pregnant women. We completed a phase 3 program in about 5,000 women, pregnant women in multiple countries in sub-Saharan region. And that gave me a lot of insights into what do you need to do to engage communities and it was not just working with the investigators at the hospitals or in the antenatal clinics, but with the midwives and healthcare workers. So I learned a lot. I used to spend 2 to 3 months every year for 10 years in sub-Saharan region in different countries, just to understand what is needed, what it takes to do quality research in the region. And I think my experience from India came very handy, because there are differences, but also there are a lot of similarities across. And what I really enjoyed and feel very proud of working with these communities was that the passion, the purpose with which they work, the eagerness to learn, curiosity to learn and come up to the best standards, as well as collaborating across within the region, but also with partners, whether they are in US, Europe, and just make it happen. So I'm really proud to be here as well, and will be happy to share any more experiences
Thank
that
you
you may.
so much, Rika. Prof. Moji, is the definition of underrepresented populations changing, and are there new groups to be considered? I mean, Jean-Marie mentioned MPOX and the gay community, which is also somewhat controversial in with some African countries because some populations are criminalized, etc. So, can you address this definition of underrepresented populations and whether it is changing and whether we need to include other groups? Thanks.
Thank you very much again, Kerry. In Nigeria, we don't really have some special underrepresented populations. We have subpopulations, pregnant women that were not even thought of in terms of inclusion in clinical research. We have children, and it is the issue about children is cultural. That you don't play around with children. You don't play around with including them in clinical research or in experiments and whatnot. That is changing. In Nigeria, I believe we are so diverse and accommodating that we cannot pinpoint some special underrepresented populations. Of course, we have the leprosy, colonies, even those reached out, we reach out to them. The government reaches out to them. Talk of mpox, all diseases are accepted in terms of the people that are affected. NAFDAC did a cohort event monitoring on mpox, and we're still in it actually. But we just don't discriminate in terms of a particular population that we cannot reach, because we see everybody aside from women, pregnant women, because they are special populations that the people don't want to mess up with, and it's cultural. The same thing with children. Well, another population that may be considered underrepresented are older women. Again, it's because we revere our older women, our geriatric population. But from the regulatory perspective, what we are reaching out to, or the populations we are reaching out to, the researchers, is for them to know that we must include the population around that demographics. For example, HIV/AIDS, women, children. Well, children were not involved at the beginning because I was in the US at the peak of HIV/AIDS pandemic in Nigeria. Women and children were left out. Well, there were no drugs actually for anybody, but when there were drugs, women, children were left out at the beginning, and then they realized the men were dying first at the onset of the pandemic in Nigeria. So the women are the survivors. They were positive, and then the children also were being noticed. So to answer your question, there isn't a special population that we're going to ignore. So long as you are human beings, you are welcome. But what Ronsi was talking about in terms of early involvement in clinical trials of African population, extremely important. We represent less than 5%, we meaning Africans, in terms of clinical research. That to me is should be the focus, to increase clinical trials in Africa and to ensure that you're working with the regulators, to ensure that the regulators know what they are doing also. That's why the WHO global benchmarking that is going on right now is extremely important, because clinical trial is one of our 9 models that a regulatory agency must meet sub-indicators sub-indicators, individual development sub-indicators that they must meet. So when doing clinical research, please, the regulators must be involved, and the regulators must know we are growing in Africa. We have 54 countries, and we are growing every day in terms of maturity. If you go to a country that doesn't have that still doesn't have, or not yet having a matured regulatory agency, there may be very, very bad outcomes later, because the clinical research cannot be better than the regulatory agency and the ethics committee. So the first thing, like I mentioned, is the design, analyze, and communicate, involving the regulatory agency. So important. Involving the ethics committee. Part of least resistance cannot be taken for clinical trials. If it is part of least resistance where the regulatory agency doesn't know what they are doing yet, because it is a dynamic progress now, the probability that the outcomes will be bad is very high. So I cannot just overemphasize the fact that, first, in Nigeria, we do not really have subpopulations that we don't touch. We touch everybody, so long as we're man and woman, children, adults, pregnant women. Now, pregnant women, I want to emphasize pregnant women and children. Now that we are getting into it, and it is because they are very, very vulnerable populations. Of course, that is the way it is in most countries in the world. But in Africa, we just thought that, those are ones that you shouldn't touch, whereas they should be included in clinical research. Over. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Jean-Marie, do you think that there are any, from your vantage point, have you identified any new groups that are not really being taken into consideration?
Yeah, thanks a lot. So because I was talking about how we think ahead when we are designing these calls that give birth to projects that do this research, I just want to describe the current context which make us shift what we find in terms of infectious disease, and start by giving an example of climate and health, because we are now designing some of these projects having in our mind the changing climate and the impact it has on health and on pathogens, on disease spread. And then we find ourselves in a situation where you have populations, for example, that live in forest settings. Each country has maybe some of those groups that have stayed in their own original life settings. There are other countries that it may be a desert population, which is maybe not traditionally included in research because just for accessibility reasons. But if you do research on a pathogen which is affecting them, you will end up bringing a product which was never studied on them. So in that context of climate and health, we find ourselves putting a brackets which include the long list of country-specific subpopulations that are traditionally underrepresented in studies, not necessarily because it was decided to exclude them, but because maybe they were not thought of when someone designing a feasible study in a setting where you have a lab or a clinic at a short drive distance. So that's one group. But at the same time, linking climate and health and conflict affected zones, we have what we call in our language, maybe not just our language, but what is called displaced populations. So that may be internal within a small geography or outside their own place of life. We know when we are following up studies that you do look at loss to follow up if you have your recruited participants, and that investigators try to have a study which will minimize the numbers of loss to follow up. But if you are including those living in the refugee camps and may change from camp to camp every week, every month, as a study designer, as an investigator, you may be tempted just to recruit from places where you are going to have as less as possible lost follow-up. But that will lead to you excluding all these millions of men and women and children who may be forced by conflicts or by climate change to be moving from province to province. So displaced populations are what we are now seeing as underrepresented, not necessarily because people forget or do not like to do research in them, but because they want to design a study which will be feasible within the budget they have, the timelines they have, whether it's industry-run study or public-funded study. That's one. Another one is related to what I'd linked to evolving technologies that allow us to run studies without necessarily going too close to the participants. So these are studies which are in the context of digital technologies. An example is a study recently funded by our own organization where visualization technologies are being used to do diagnosis of skin diseases. And that study does not necessarily mean that I have to come to you as a participant and look at you at 1 centimeter, 1 meter close. You can send me an image by using your own mobile device. So that would mean that those populations that do not have access to those technologies will become underrepresented in these kind of studies. Maybe it's not yet the biggest group, but going ahead, we may find ourselves that we are doing research on populations that have access to technologies that we use in our studies. So here again, it becomes the responsibilities of all the stakeholders to make sure that is captured in case you are designing a study that rely on technologies. Make sure you're also recruiting from places that have limited access to that technology. So that's another category. Now, maybe linking to where I started from, that example of gay communities in HIV or Mpox affected regions. It's much broader. It's in a much broader context, which includes legislation and localized marginalization. If you have a country where legally you are told that those who identify themselves as homosexuals will be punished, that will mean that researchers are going maybe to find ways of avoiding using such terms in the study protocols. And that will mean that that group will be underrepresented in the study because there is a legislation which basically leads to these unintended or intended effects. But it's also the stigma which is still in a lot of pockets of the globe where maybe some groups may be marginalized, stigmatized, and then those will stay just in their own little communities, trying to use whatever means they have to treat themselves. But if an outbreak comes of these pathogens, which are afraid by everyone, the whole planet, if you see a virus erupting from a village in Congo and later you know that it was an Ebola outbreak and everyone wants to avoid that Ebola outbreak spreading across, you will see that in those moments, whether it's a vaccine that was developed somewhere, or a diagnostic tool, or a medicinal product, they will come to those communities to be used for vaccination or treatment. But there is a high chance that those populations, because maybe they were marginalized, they were neglected, that they were not included in the studies that led to these products. So it's this group that is difficult to name, which is never included in studies that later become crucial for emergency use of products. So when we develop products for rare pathogens, it's good to think of pockets of potential pockets of the pathogen. So it's something which we observe on, let's say, maybe Ebola and COVID are good examples of where you see vaccines being brought into communities that were never involved in the research that led up to the products. That was maybe a long answer to your question, but happy to elaborate later.
No, fascinating. And I think it's a good lesson that we need to adapt, or science needs to adapt according to conditions, including climate, and whatever diseases are presenting themselves. Rika, I know that you're itching to tell us about a trial that you have experience with in Africa. So do you want to take the floor, please?
Sure, Kerry. So one thing I just wanted to share is that in global health at Novartis, we are not just working on malaria. We have a huge portfolio for malaria that I can share. But besides that, we are also working on visceral leishmaniasis. We completed a phase 2 trial in partnership with DNDi in India, but also in Ethiopia. We have completed enrollment, and I am right now in Ghana, in Accra. We just launched an Coartem new formulation with new dosing strengths and the new ratio, because artemisinin are absorbed very, very quickly in neonates, and also they are eliminated slowly. So we had to reduce the dose of artemisinin, and we did trial in newborns, in less than 1 month babies, and we got it approved in Switzerland, but also in Ghana. And yesterday was the launch, so I'm really proud of it. But before that, I was in Nairobi, and we were having meeting. I think somebody had raised a question, doing studies in Sudan. So we have Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Kenya, part of that trial, phase 3 trial that we are planning to start very soon. So that there are challenges. And I learned a word in Ghana, chin chim. It's that the road, life's road is twisted, but we shall walk it. And that is the spirit that I think all of us need to have. Yes, there are going to be difficulties, challenges in enrolling these patients. We did talk about patients who are living in these they move from border depending upon where they find the work or the food, they move at the border, from Sudan to Ethiopia or Kenya, and come back. And then how do you make sure that you are following these patients? And it was amazing that how, when we put all our minds together, we had potential investigators, or that we are going to be working with, but also from the governments, from policymakers, and people came up with such creative ideas. And see, it's really very, very energizing to me. That is one thing I wanted to share. So we are going to be working in those areas. Acute Chagas, we went to northern part of Brazil in Amazon forests, where there are one room hospitals, or healthcare centers, and you have to take a boat to go there. And we are doing trials over there. We did a lot of capacity building, because that's where acute Chagas patients are seen right now. And Visa, the regulatory agency over there, got very we are partnering with them now, and to see how we can help with capacity building in those parts of the country where it is, where patients are, where it's difficult to do trials. But I also wanted to share a platform trial in multiple countries, sub-Saharan region. We went to AVAREF, which is African Vaccine Regulatory Forum, to present our study. It's a platform phase 2 trial somebody had mentioned doing early trials. That is one of the limitation. No, I think we are doing a phase 2 trial with novel chemical entities, multiple novel antimalarials. They are, so you have done first in human healthy volunteer study, and then they go first time in patients. We start with multiple cohorts, one monotherapy, once that drug is safe and seems to be effective in different dosing regimens. We select the dosing regimen to combine with another novel therapy. And then we are starting with adults, going to adolescents, going to children, all the way up to 2 years in the same trial. And that trial that we are doing, we have completed 2 cohorts, and data, fingers crossed, but blinded data looks good so far. And we are doing it in partnership with MMB and EDCTP. And it is, and what we are seeing is in Novartis, which is a huge company, we are doing hundreds of trials, but that trial has become the example of how to do innovative programs, not just in developing world, but even developed world. That is a very unique trial, very innovative trial, and I'm very, very proud of our investigators and EDCTP and MMB, and we are working in partnership, and so it is doable. It is possible to do very innovative stuff in these countries. It's only a matter of that can-do attitude.
Thank you, Rika. I think that the global health road is definitely chin-chim at the moment. Lots of twists and turns, as we all know. So we'll take that as a lesson. Ransi, you're dealing with patients. So do you think that there are lessons from that you have learned through on inclusivity in trials and so on that can be applied elsewhere, but also maybe things that you feel have not quite gone right and that you would like to see improvements on the continent? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very, very much. So I think there are so many things that are going right now in Africa that I think the world needs to learn from, right? Number one is one of the biggest problems that Africa is facing, which is Africans funding its own African intervention. It's changed, and thanks to COVID. Do you know that in 2020, that a conglomerate of African business leaders came together and raised over $20 million in 4 months to mitigate COVID-19? And those are some of the reasons why COVID did not have a huge impact in countries like Africa, because people have now in fact, the name of the organization is actually known as CAR COVID. They came together through a platform driven by Aspire Coronation Trusts, which brought Dangote, brought the Access Bank CEO, who we lost a few years ago, and Alakija, so many of them together. So I think this is a very huge example that it's not being spotlighted, both in the clinical world, in research world, in global funding world. It's always been promoted that business leaders and philanthropists in Africa don't do enough in supporting Africa. They're doing, I think those kind of lessons really need to be spotlighted to show that many African business leaders are beginning to understand that it's important that Africa begin to invest in its own self, not just only in interventions, in community intervention and development, but also in health investment and all the rest of that. And they need to be encouraged, I believe. I think the second part again, which I think this is probably the first time, consult and spirit of 2025 for the first time are really including African voices. I would say that I was the only African that was involved in writing the consults, 2025 and also the Spirit 2025. And interestingly, this is the first consult and spirit statement that we actually pushed for patient and public involvement in research, which I think it's so important. Because some of the biggest problems we've had thinking about this from Africa is that we are a continent of a collective people. We're a continent that have a collective culture. We're a continent that believe that, you don't do something, on your own, but, you should do something bringing the entire village together. So anything around community outreach and involvement and engagement, it's a model that Africa have grown over the years. So this is the kind of thing we need to include in research as well, so that you don't just want to do research, you already package the research in an AC building, maybe somewhere in Washington, D.C. or in Geneva, and you just arrive, you just have that package already and you're ready to deliver. Involving people from the beginning will endanger trust, will propel trust, will propel, that power. And then I think the last thing I would also say is, I've spoken at many conferences in New York, in Chicago, and I've always heard that there is no data in Africa. That's what people would always say. So I think what we are doing right now in Africa is that we are creating our own data, because that's one reason that have been used to say, okay, research can be done in this continent. And that I think are some ideas that are huge lessons.
Thank you, Ransi. And I think that's a perfect segue to the question that I want to ask Prof. Monty, which is, can other regions learn from lessons and best practices from Africa on inclusivity? Because we are on the continent, we're often getting lectures from others, and we're getting, as Ransi says, these pre-packaged things from Washington, etc., that we are supposed to just implement. But it is very clear that there's so much richness and so much experience. So how do we impart these lessons? What are these lessons, and how do we impart them to other regions, Prof?
Thank you so much again. I'm going to start with the regulatory agencies again. Africa, we now have 9, going to maybe 10 African countries with maturity level 3, WHO maturity level 3. The stronger the regulatory agency is, the higher the probability that there will be inclusivity. Because the regulatory agency doesn't get to maturity level 3 without meeting the sub-indicators that include, in clinical trial, that include inclusivity, that include GCP, good GCP training and whatnot. Another thing that I believe to be learned is that strong regulatory agencies in Africa are now demanding phase 4 clinical trial. Ronsi just mentioned that for the cancer drug that he quoted, about 90% or 95% are Caucasians. Including populations, subpopulations in Africa, extremely important. It's also a business decision for companies, because the probability of uptake of such medicines is very high if there is a phase 4, even if there is no phases 1, 2, 3, and you do bridging studies. That is one thing that should also be learned. One thing that I forgot to mention is some of the subpopulations, nomadic populations in Nigeria, for example. And Jean-Marie mentioned that in passing, rather, their own environment is in the desert or desert-like area, or in the bushes where they tend to their shepherds. And you will not find most of them in the cities. That is a subpopulation. One thing that we have also been regulatory agencies have been sensitive to are disabled people. disabled people, and regulatory agencies have to sensitize researchers to be sensitive. They may not be able to come. They should go to them. They should go to them. Now we have remote clinical trial, where you can gather your data using, telephones or some monitoring devices. So these two populations are the ones that I didn't include, but I was just talking generally in terms of, do we ignore? It's not like we ignore them, it is that we don't meet them where they are. Just to underscore some of the things that Jean-Marie said. But I mentioned earlier that a clinical outcome cannot be greater than the regulatory agency or than a very strong institution, because you may not have a great regulatory agency, but if you have a very strong university where there's a platform for clinical trial, yes. So when there is a need to use subpopulations, think of the regulatory agency, think of DAC, communicate. The C part of it is extremely important. Whether you are going to the nomads or you're going to disabled people, you've got to engage them. Once you engage the people that are going to be involved and they understand where you are coming from. Good thing about Africa is we can believe easily if there is a lot of communication. And that will go a long way in terms of the clinical outcomes. So communicate. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. The first webinar, actually, there was a nurse from a rural part of Kenya who was talking about engaging nomadic communities and how they had hired community mobilizers on motorbikes to go and find them at watering holes and so on. It was really quite instructive because it showed the great effort that they took, but it was worth it in the end because they got a representative population. There are a couple of questions in the chat, so I'm just going to try and pick up a few of them. The first one is underrepresented populations the same as vulnerable populations? Does anybody want to address that?
I can try.
I would like to. Oh, sorry.
I can try after Prof. Prof, go ahead.
Prof?
Underrepresented, vulnerable populations are children, pregnant women. Underrepresented nomadics, disabled people, gay communities. In Nigeria, we do not discriminate. A man is a man, a woman is a woman. Mm-hmm. But if we have a group and we need to, like the gay community, and we need to have a comparative design, we do not discriminate. So in terms of vulnerable, these are geriatrics, pediatrics, pregnant women compared to underrepresented population. Thank you.
Ransi, do you want to add or should we go on to another question?
Yeah, I mean, I can add, I think I would just come in from a different sort of a patient advocacy viewpoint that, and I agree with Prof about vulnerable patient. I also agree with other, speakers who have mentioned about underrepresentation. But in my own personal opinion, I think there are also some population that we could call the voiceless population, unheard population, and neglected population. And I will explain what those populations mean. And people may argue with me that this viewpoint, it's really not possible, but I think that Africa in general is probably a huge unheard population. Africa as a continent.
Yes.
Africa as a continent is also a neglected population. I also think Africa, it's really many Africans in Africa are also the voiceless population. And those voiceless population are people like, just as Prof has said, geriatric patient, which is older adults, people living in crisis zones, Africans living in metastatic disease that really, their disease have really relegated them that they are only facing pain and waiting for death. Or also people who poverty cannot even allow them to access any care. Let's contextualize this a little bit, right? And let's contextualize through two ways. The first one is, do we know that 20 of the 54 African countries are facing a crisis today? Worse humanitarian conditions, including conflict, violence, disease outbreak, and all the rest. In Sudan alone, 30 million people, I mean patient, human being need aid. In Somalia alone, about 1.6 children are facing acute malnutrition. Sudan, South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, this is a country that produces all the that have all the resources for this smartwatch and iPhone that we use. So everyone who wears any smart device should always think about Democratic Republic of Congo. Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, Mali, Niger, Chad, many other countries are all facing conflict. But in most UN meetings, would you hear of Africa? You will not. You will hear of other continents where other crises are happening. But all these crises from Africa are unheard. Well, I know this is not a humanitarian kind of meeting. But let's also contextualize this from Lassa fever. Lassa fever was identified in 1969 in a town known as Lassa in Borno in Nigeria. Lassa fever is endemic in Nigeria, in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in Guinea, and most part of West Africa. Since 1969, there was no vaccine that have been identified for Lassa fever. The only vaccine that we see coming up now is a phase 2 clinical trial that just started in March 2024. So the truth is that we have to face the truth. Just only from January to September, over 895 cases of Lassa fever have been found in Nigeria, and suspected case of over 7,000 people. In fact, 166 deaths have already occurred in Nigeria. More people have been killed by Lassa fever than COVID-19. But COVID-19 was discovered in December 2019. By March of 2020, first candidate of human trial has already begun. In less than a year, a vaccine is available. But for Lassa fever has been killing people for over 40 years. There is no vaccine. Africa is the unheard voice, is the voiceless population, is the neglected population. So many people are underrepresented in clinical research, but there is also those voiceless, unheard, neglected population whose needs are not sought, those who live in environments that are unsafe, and those whose illness have been relegated to pain and death. Thank you.
Thanks, Ransi. I just wanted to pop in a WHO comment, which is that they are moving away from the use of the word vulnerable to rather use underrepresented and underserved, including children and pregnant women. So I think just to put that in there. There are two questions that I'm going to add in. Sorry, Prof.
I'm traveling right now, so if you don't hear my voice, it's because
Okay.
I have to board the plane. Thank you.
Okay, well, if we don't hear you, thank you so much.
Thank
Your
you.
participation was fabulous. You've got fans in the chat saying that your comments about don't leave the regulator behind are the best comments. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hopefully
Thank you
you
very
can
much.
still hear us, but thanks a lot.
I will stay here. I will try.
Thanks. There's a question from an up-and-coming clinical researcher who says, "Can I volunteer to do any of to be involved in this good work with underrepresented populations?" Rika, maybe you can answer that. Are there opportunities for volunteers?
Yeah, so I'm assuming, I'm understanding that this person is a clinical researcher. Yeah, definitely. I think we are very open to working with potential investigators in the region. We work in all developing countries right now, and our programs are I can just share with you malaria, sickle cell disease, Chagas, visceral leishmaniasis, cutaneous leishmaniasis, cryptosporidiosis. We are also working on Nipah virus, measles. So we are not in vaccines, but we are developing drugs. We are working on dengue, and we had some very good meetings here in Ghana with some of the experts who infectious disease experts who are realizing that even though dengue is not that commonly reported in sub-Saharan region, but actually there are quite a few cases here which are not diagnosed because maybe diagnostics are not that readily available. And when they did serology to see it, it seems about 30, more than 30 to 40% of the populations in different parts of Ghana were positive with antibodies. It means those people have been infected at some point, and probably that was misdiagnosed. So we are working in all these diseases, and so I'll be happy to like share my email, and please feel free to reach out to me. And we are always looking for potential investigators who can work with us. And thank you for
There you
that.
go. Might be your lucky break. Thank you so much, Rika. There's an interesting question here. I hope I'm understanding it properly. I see the differences in how a drug, different bodies metabolize drugs differently based on ethnicity as well. Is there a requirement to oblige the inclusion of African countries and subjects to market the drug afterwards in Africa to make sure that it's appropriate for the community, those communities? I I think it's a fair question. I mean, I raised earlier the whole thing about antiretrovirals being totally unsuitable for African women because they'd only been trialed on white men in the US. And that it caused a big problem for certainly for South Africa. So Jean-Marie, maybe, do you want to see whether you can take that one? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I will quickly take it. I see that time is running. That is a fair question because what has happened maybe a few decades ago is that a lot of products were developed outside Africa and were marketed in Africa. But at some point, regulatory agencies were weak maybe to tackle this question. But luckily, we've entered an age where regulators, before giving marketing authorization in many parts of Africa, do ask for the data which confirm that these studies were studied on the continent. From the perspective of where I work, I've seen that a lot of studies try to address this question, where you have products approved by FDA or EMA, but have never been studied in any African country. And we do fund studies to do exactly that, where you want to collect data which will give you enough external validity if you want to get them marketed in Africa. So it's an area which we see growing because there's also maybe it's part of I'm a pharmacist by background, so and also pharmacologist. There is need, of course, if you're a clinician, to know if you are dosing correctly, for example, and that is also a question which can vary from population to population. And if you compare diseases that are prevalent in Africa much more than others, you will see in the Southern Africa region a lot of work has been done on HIV, for example, and there you will see that a lot of studies in the past few decades have done this, have worked on this question of looking at products developed in the US or in Europe, if they can still, if pharmacology is still the same as what was in the first regulatory dossiers. So those regulators in those countries do have data collecting the population based on that. That's an example, and it's an important question that has to be taken into account when new products are coming to the market in Africa, whether it's vaccine or drugs.
Thank you so much, Jean-Marie. There are loads of questions now, but unfortunately we've run out of time, but it's fabulous to see all the interest. So I am going to just thank our panel. I think that we had a really excellent time. I'm sorry that Rika, you hopped in on and off, but I think I think it was a very rich discussion and varied, and you've each got different perspectives, which was really helpful. So just thanks to everybody, the previous panels as well. I think it certainly broadened my horizons, and I'm now going to hand over to Janice, who's going to explain about the future panels. So thanks to everybody.
Thank you, Carrie, and thanks again to all the speakers, the presenters, and the panelists. I think this has been a really rich discussion, and we're glad that you as participants have stayed with us and have asked your questions. And just to let you know that we will make the recordings of today available on the website along with individual presentations. So do watch out for that, and we really appreciate, again, everybody's participation. I think what really struck me today from the conversations that we heard is, that it is really important, the concept of inclusivity, to really protect people through research, but then to also look at the fact that inclusion brings better science. And I think that is something that will resonate with me moving forward, along with looking at how inclusivity and inclusion can be really seen as a principle of justice, how the benefits and the research are equally distributed, and ensuring that the safety and efficacy are appropriate for the populations that are going to use the medicine. So I think this is just really key, along with hearing that our panelists and our experts believe that Africa has a lot to share with the rest of the world and the rest of the region, that they do not have to be the recipients of everything, but that they can share their pragmatic leadership, their strength with everybody else. So I think that's really important and a good takeaway from my side as well. I'd like to then talk a little bit about the next upcoming webinar. So maybe we can take a look at this slide. And just to remind you that our next webinar is going to change tack a little bit, focus more on the innovation in clinical trial designs and digital technologies. We heard from one of our speakers earlier today that there's a lot going on to be able to bring in different populations and decentralization of clinical trials and outreach and telehealth. So I think this will be really good opportunity, and we do hope you will be able to join us. If you haven't registered, you can scan the QR code that you see on your screen now and do that. That webinar will be on the 21st of October, or you can go to the website. There's still opportunity to sign up for that. The other thing we would really like you to do is we have a survey today to help us always improve our webinars, to hear what you thought about today's webinar. So we would really appreciate if you could spend some time and just do this quick poll via Zoom to let us know what you think. So with that, I think we would like to say a big thank you again to the speakers, the panelists, and the presenters today. We couldn't have done it without you, and I think it's a really valuable and rich discussion. And with that, we'd like to say thanks again, and everybody, wishing you a good day wherever you joined us from. So take care. Thank you very much.